In today's video, we'll be looking at one of the most infamous sinkings in the history of the Royal Navy. The Courageous class, the main pair, were unfortunate ships. Courageous was sunk by a U-boat, becoming the first British capital ship lost in the Second World War. Their half-sister, Furious, was more lucky. She survived the conflict and was quietly scrapped in the aftermath. However, that leaves HMS Glorious. Glorious would become the only case of a fleet carrier sunk by enemy gunfire. This came in summer 1940 and has become infamous ever since. With all of that said, however, Glorious had a lengthy career before that sinking. Let's look at that first before we talk about her ultimate fate. Glorious's career began on May 1st, 1915, at the height of the Great War. The ship was laid down on that day by Harland and Wolff in Belfast. Considering the timing, her construction past this point was remarkably speedy. Glorious would be launched on April 20th, 1916, just under a year after her keel was laid. Her initial commissioning came even faster on October 14th of 1916, although a couple collisions would delay her entry to service, first striking a buoy after her commissioning, then being hit by the steamer Corrib while in dock on November 19th, 1916. As a result, she only left port on December 30th and joined the fleet in January of 1917. This means she missed most of the Great War, including Jutland, for better or worse. Although, before we can get to the service she did see, we need to talk design, which for Glorious was a rather unique one. Not quite to the extent of Furious, but not for lack of trying either. That design began as one of the interesting ideas from the mind of one Jackie Fisher, the single greatest proponent of lightly armored and fast warships. While I'll go into greater detail on this when I cover Courageous, I'll give the short version here. The Royal Navy had put a moratorium on capital ship construction. This meant no more battlecruisers, at least for a little while. However, Fisher was rarely one to take no for an answer, so he went the creative route to get more battlecruisers authorized. Thus was born the Large Light Cruiser. Ships armed like battlecruisers, but in most other respects, basically being really big light cruisers. Also intended for the frankly ridiculous Baltic project. In simple terms, landing a large infantry force in northern Germany. You can guess how successful that would have been. To do this project, it required a shallow draft. In this case, about 25 feet on Glorious. In any event, the design that resulted was a bit of a weird one. Glorious displaced around 19,500 tons at her normal load. This went up to 22,700 at the deep loading. This was substantially lighter than even the Lions, being more in line with the first generation of British battlecruiser. The ships were built light. About the only thing that wasn't light about them was the main battery. 2 twin turrets carrying the new 15-inch 381mm gun, a total of 4 barrels with 1 turret on the bow and 1 on the stern. The secondary battery, meanwhile, consisted of 6 triple 4-inch 102mm mounts, 18 barrels in total. Weaponry after this was rounded off by 2 single 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and 2 single 21-inch torpedo tubes submerged on either side of the bow turret. I would not want to get close enough to use those, or the 8 above water tubes installed in 1917, because the armor protection was basically non-existent, no more than 2 to 3 inches for the main belt, or 51 to 76 millimeters. The deck was actually just as thick, going up to 3 inches at its thickest. Remember, these ships are basically giant light cruisers. Their theoretical top speed continued to match this concept, a maximum of 32 knots on 90,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. However, Courageous developed serious structural damage when she ran into rough waters at top speed, a victim of the light construction. In any event, though, that rounds off the design detail. Longer than average, but worth it to give some background. Now back to service, which, as said earlier, began in January of 1917. By this point, the time of great sea battles was mostly over. After Jutland, the High Seas Fleet mostly avoided confrontation with the Royal Navy, although both sides would continue various abortive attempts at a battle. None of these came to much, although smaller scale engagements did happen a couple times. One of those, the Second Battle of Helgoland Bight, would be Glorious's one engagement in her original design. Prior to this, Glorious had only participated in a couple escort operations. Most of 1917 was fairly quiet. Even this battle was, in its own right, a pretty inconclusive one. The Germans were performing a minesweeping operation, while the British sent a force of cruisers and destroyers, backed by 3 battle cruisers, to try and contest it. The two groups came into contact on November 17, 1917, which devolved into a long-range gunnery duel while the Germans withdrew under smoke. Courageous and Glorious, for their part, contributed fairly little. They evidently caused more damage to themselves, with muzzle blasts damaging the deck. Regardless, the rest of the Great War would pass quietly. Glorious would receive above-water torpedo tubes at some point in 1917 or 1918, 4 twin mounts in total. In addition to this, the ship also received 2 flying-off platforms for scout aircraft. Both of those modifications saw no active use of note. In fact, there were only 2 notable events left for HMS Glorious, neither involving combat. The first came on November 5, 1918. That was the sinking of HMS Campania, a seaplane tender that broke her mooring in a strong gale. This caused Campania to drift first into HMS Royal Oak and then scrape along the side of Glorious. This did no notable damage to the battle cruiser, but Campania would sink. The other incident came on November 21st, when Glorious was present for the surrender of the High Seas Fleet, the last time she was involved with that German formation, but not the last time she was involved with German battleships. In any event, after the Great War ended, Glorious was put into reserve. By February of 1919, the ship was being used as a turret drill ship. The Royal Navy recognized the limitations of Glorious's design and saw no use for her as an active warship, or at least as an active battlecruiser. What they really liked, however, was the idea of converting her into an aircraft carrier. In the aftermath of the Washington Treaty, this plan would go forward. Courageous and Glorious were taken in hand to be converted, following a similar pattern to their half-sister, HMS Furious. With certain improvements, after several test designs were discarded, Glorious went in for her conversion in February 1924. This would take until February 1930, which goes to show how much work went into it. To keep things short and sweet for this video, Glorious was cut down to the waterline. The ship was then rebuilt up from there with a double-layer design, again reminiscent of Furious. This saw the ship fitted with 2 hangar decks, one atop the other. This multi-level hangar would be a defining feature of British carriers for quite some time. The Courageous class, Furious included, took it a step further. They fit a flying-off deck over the old bow, with the upper hangar opening to it. This was intended to allow lighter aircraft, such as fighters, to take off straight from the hangar. And it did work, until aircraft became too heavy to use the shorter deck. You see a similar thing done in Japan, except they went for a triple-layer deck. In any event, the other modifications were more traditional as it were. 2 elevators to carry aircraft to the main flight deck, and an island plus funnel mounted on the starboard side. Admittedly, the ship did look a bit top-heavy after the conversion, thanks to how high her new superstructure was. To go along with that superstructure, the carrier also picked up new weaponry. The big guns and inefficient secondaries were gone, replaced by 16 single 4.7-inch 120mm dual-purpose guns. A pair of those were mounted on the lower flying off deck. Another pair was mounted on the stern. The remaining 12 were carried along the side, with 6 on either broadside. All of these modifications did not increase the length. That remained 786 feet, or 240 meters. The displacement, however, did go up, from 19,500 tons to 25,370 tons at the normal loading, and from 22,719 tons to 27,560 for the deep load. This extra weight came in a cost in speed, which fell to 30 knots. As near as I can tell, there were no substantial changes made to the power plant. The same goes for armor protection, which retained the thin belt armor of the original design. As for aircraft, as designed, Glorious could carry 48. This would naturally change as aircraft grew in size and capability. That rounds off the changes to the design, so let's go back to service. After her refit, HMS Glorious recommissioned on February 24, 1930, technically for the Mediterranean Fleet, although she actually served with the Atlantic Fleet first. She only sailed for the Mediterranean in June, arriving to relieve Courageous, although her initial service would not go well. Glorious was in dry dock in Malta for 5 months from July to December. This was because she damaged 3 of her turbines on the voyage to the Mediterranean. Remember, the ship was equipped with 4 turbines, so you can see the issue. When those repairs were completed, Glorious took up her role with the Mediterranean Fleet, at least for a few months. After rejoining the fleet in December, the ship prepared for training exercises, including sparring with HMS Eagle in one of the first carrier versus carrier experiments. That took place in January 1931. A follow-up exercise around Gibraltar took place in late March and early April. Unfortunately, bad luck would strike the ship once more. In thick fog, Glorious rammed the French ocean liner Florida. This crumpled 60 feet of the carrier's bow while causing serious damage to the liner. Repairs for that would last into September. Not the greatest of starts, but the rest of her time in the 1930s would be much easier on the carrier, for the most part, with the exception of another major refit from July 1934 to July 1935, which seems to have at least partially been prompted by yet more damage. In this case, in March of 1934, high waves punched in the doors to the upper hangar. This caused damage to the ship and wrecked 6 aircraft. Glorious returned home, where she was put into that major refit. This would raise the quarterdeck, along with extending the flight deck further to the stern. This extension is the simplest way to tell Courageous and Glorious apart after the refit. The ship was also fitted with new arrestor gear and a pair of catapults, along with 3 octuple pom-pom mounts. When this refit was complete, Glorious returned to her old duty. This would see her be the first carrier to pick up swordfish in July of 1936. And in August, the ship put those planes to work in nighttime landing training, with lighting apparently designed aboard the ship. Glorious would put further work into night flight experiments in March of 1937. Soon after that, the ship was present for the coronation review for King George VI on May 20th, after which Glorious returned to the Mediterranean for the rest of the 1930s. This would mostly focus on more training, with the exception of a stint patrolling near Spain during the Spanish Civil War. So let's move to the Second World War. This found Glorious still in the Mediterranean in September 1939, although she wouldn't remain there for very long. By October, the ship moved through Suez to take up station in the Indian Ocean, specifically to hunt for German raiders, such as, for example, the famous Graf Spee. This would ultimately come to nothing, however, so Glorious returned to Alexandria by January 1940. and from there on to Britain in April. The ship had been recalled to help support the operations in Norway, quite likely because her sister, Courageous, had been sunk back in September of 1939. Regardless, Glorious was back home for what would turn out to be her final campaign. This began by transferring aircraft to Norway. In this, she joined Ark Royal in flying off RAF aircraft on April 24, 1940. After this, she remained off Norway for a couple days, performing follow-up airstrikes, before returning home to refuel on April 27th. Over the course of May, Glorious would make multiple trips to Norway to fly off RAF Hurricanes, among other things. These were successful missions, with the exception of bad weather on May 21st. However, these successes could not change the course of the Norwegian campaign. By early June, the British forces were ordered to withdraw. Glorious would sail to Norway on June 2nd to provide cover. However, the ship only carried 9 Sea Gladiators and 6 Swordfish. It was hoped that she could evacuate RAF aircraft. And in fairness, 10 Gladiators and 7 Hurricanes were landed aboard on June 7th, the first time such high-performance monoplanes, in the case of the Hurricanes, landed on a British carrier without a tailhook. Unfortunately, in successfully picking up those planes, Glorious might have doomed herself. She lacked her full air wing, which might have left her without proper scouting. I say might because the exact circumstances of her sinking are a bit of a touchy subject. Certainly too much to get into in this video without it becoming a 40-minute monster. As such, I'll leave that for a later video, either a Saturday extra or a Sunday upload. For the purposes of this video, we'll do the short version. While sailing home, HMS Glorious was ambushed by the terrible twins on June 8, 1940. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which found the carrier and her escorts. Those escorts, HMS Ardent and HMS Acosta, would do their best to protect Glorious. Ardent would sink first after scouting ahead. She attempted to torpedo the Germans and landed a single shell hit on Scharnhorst. It wasn't enough, and Ardent would be sunk. Glorious, meanwhile, was hit multiple times from long range. The first of which, at 26,000 yards, or 24,000 meters, is one of the longest range in history. These hits would wreck the flight deck, start fires in the hangar, and destroy aircraft. One hit crippled Glorious. This was to the engine room, which slowed her down and locked her in a turn to port. The Germans closed the range and continued to fire on Glorious. She would ultimately be sunk by this fire around 6 p.m. Acosta, meanwhile, managed to torpedo Scharnhorst before she was sunk in turn, the last of the British ships to go down. The exact circumstances of this incident are again touchy. How much it came down to a poor captain, or bad decisions, or too little fuel to sail at high speed. There's even an argument it was a sacrifice to save the Norwegian royal family, as HMS Devonshire didn't forward a distress call to maintain radio silence, while carrying the aforementioned royalty. Again, however, that's a topic for a dedicated video. No matter what happened, this sinking was a tragedy. Only 40 survivors were rescued, with 1 each from Ardent and Acosta, although you'll also see 43 from Glorious and up to 2 each from Ardent and Acosta. It depends on the source. Either way, this remains a tragedy. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.